Hello, and welcome to the Product Insiders LinkedIn Live series, where we interview product leaders and learn how they leverage customer insights to navigate tough product decisions. I'm your host, Zach Lyons, managing partner of Agile Innovation Advisors. Now, if you're joining us live today, please enter your location in the chat so we know who is with us. Today, our guest is Jennifer Bryson, Senior Director of Product Management for Microsoft's Global Consumer Sales. And we'll be asking Jennifer some questions, as we always do. But if you have any specific questions for her, please enter them in the chat and we'll get to them in a bit. So with that, let's begin. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Zach. I'm really excited to dive into this. It's not often that you get to kind of just sit back and talk about customer scenarios that you've had to go through from like a 50,000 foot view. So appreciate it.
Awesome. Can't wait to hear it. So let's start. So just thinking about a tough product decision you've had to navigate in your career, can you please tell us a little bit about your role at the time and the situation?
Yeah. So back at my time, at a little retailer called Amazon, just small, not big business.
Right.
I was involved in a business that was very well-named new businesses that sat within the marketplace part of Amazon's organization. And we were chartered with launching businesses that were kind of flew in the face of Amazon's regular flywheel. And one of those businesses was collectible coins. So I won't go too long on the story, but it's kind of like an odd reason why we went into this business. We'd already gone into collectibles and autographs and wine and fine art and all these kind of other nascent businesses that have really big like presence in society, but just don't have a good online experience. But what had happened was a very wonderful gentleman named Don Kagan, who is one of the leading numisticists. Took me many years to learn that, numismatists, had partnered with a couple who had found a hoard of gold coins on their property in San Francisco. And he was looking for ways to bring a more youthful or a more technologically advanced solution to the coin collecting world. He being such a passionate individual and such a big contributor to that world, really wanted to see it advance into the next generation. And so on a whim, he had reached out to Amazon, and it had found its way across my VP's desk as a potential opportunity. And so what I was chartered with was go build a customer experience that allows us to not only sell these very one-of-a-kind rare collectible coins, but then also brings other sellers of collectible coins onto Amazon and gets them to engage in the platform and purchase them. And then we become sort of that conduit of matching. So taking it out of the terrestrial world and bring it into the digital world.
Oh, really interesting.
Yeah.
So selling something that's not a traditional item that's sold on Amazon, a collectible, it's money at that.
Yeah.
So, tell us a little bit about the challenge that you were facing. What did you have to overcome? What was difficult about doing this?
Yeah. Yes, I'm sure there was lots of them is probably the right way to put it. Yeah. So just on its face, you said it right. Like here you have something that doesn't fit within Amazon's regular ecosystem from like, you can't just take a deodorant detail page or a deodorant supply chain flow and then just flip it over to a collectible coin. So there's just the customer experience in general was going to be complicated. But then you had these additional layers around fraud and risk. As well as you had to walk a very fine line between what is considered collectible money versus now you are a dealer in bullion or precious metals, which then would unlock a whole bunch of fun things that we'd have to go do with the SEC. And unfortunately, where the collectible coin industry was at the time, a lot of people were collecting collectible gold coins, which is just another way of getting gold. And participating in the precious metals market without participating in the precious metals market. And so we had a lot of these concerns, and Amazon being a huge company, very much would have a target on their back if they were to start engaging. So there was no opportunity to really, do it on the sly, if you will. And some small businesses sometimes will do it and they're not really caught unless somebody's really investigating. But if you're Amazon and you're going to do a huge press release about it, somebody's going to notice and somebody's going to start asking questions. Absolutely. So we had sort of all those kind of external pressures. And then there was always the natural internal pressure of my VP kind of saying, I'd love this to be done in the next 3 to 4 months. And I'm also going to give you a head count. Here's a couple of people. Go have fun and go figure it out. So we had sort of just that condensed timeline internally. And then we just had these bigger kind of what would seem like impossible roadblocks externally that we had to navigate. And then just to throw it all on top of it, you had an audience for this that were not technically savvy. So shopping online and buying these types of things online, especially things that are high value, was new to them. And so you had to go through a whole journey to understand what it would take to bring a terrestrial customer into a digital world who may know Amazon, like I said, for their regular like shopping habits, but for them to go and spend, $4,000 or $5,000 a clip, somewhere up to $1 million on a single transaction was very, it's a hard thing to figure out that you're going to do online without having seen it in person.
Wow. Okay. So organizational pressure, right? Get it done. Obviously, probably to be profitable, I assume, right? As part of that, hopefully, at least at some point, right? Regulatory scrutiny, right? If you will, if you do something that you shouldn't be doing with precious metals and coins. And then, of course, the customer, right? And trying to get the customer to behave or do something differently. So a host of challenges, as you just talked about. So how did you navigate this? What did you do? How did you kind of, thread that needle, so to speak?
Yeah. So this is going to sound really basic, and I know it will, but it's sort of like you have to kind of chunk it all off into problem statements and actions that you're going to take. So let's just take the customer itself, for example, like the regulatory stuff. It's been several years since I've had to deal with that. So I don't want to say anything weird that's going to get in trouble. We can talk later about how fraud managed to manifest itself after launch, and how I learned so much about risk, if we've got time. But let's focus on just the customer. So, because ultimately we could do all these things and it didn't matter if somebody didn't actually want to come buy it from Amazon. So I kind of took two different approaches because it was a marketplace and we weren't the seller of record. You had to go convince the coin sellers who also weren't technically savvy or were just kind of emerging into the concept of how they could use technology. You had to go engage with them and get to their level of what is it that they needed and wanted. How do you get them to embrace this idea? Now, it helped that we had that gentleman, Don Kagan, who was there sort of as an ambassador to help sort of grease the wheels. But we did a lot of seller interviews, which seems a little weird because sometimes when you're building a business, you don't necessarily think about your manufacturers or your wholesalers. You're sort of like, well, we're just going to give you the platform and you'll just come engage. But we were very focused on their experience because we needed them to bring the selection and we needed them to champion it to their customers as well. And so I built some really great, strong relationships with the coin community. And again, like this is not your usual customer base. Like I came from the fashion world. So here's me coming into a coin show, went to many coin shows, coming in and sort of trying to like, as a young, not to date myself, and I'm not trying to say that the individuals there were of a particular age group, but like it's a generational hobby, trying to come in and talk to them, while they're transacting with the customer. And so I was able to build some pretty strong relationships with some trusted sellers and graders of the collectible coin industry to kind of really get their insights on what they think is necessary in order to build a good experience online. So really build aside them. Then at the same time, while I was at those coin shows, I was very observant of what the customers themselves were doing and what were the decision-making points that they had. Because again, you're trying to replicate this as much as you can online. Different when you're buying something like deodorant, where you're just like, I just want my brand and it's a price thing. Here, this is like they're about to shell over a lot of money. And so you'd see them searching in a particular way by, tables would be organized a particular way by date and by mint, and different types of coins would be organized. So the search experience was different than what you would have on Amazon, which is more logical about filtering by price and things like that. And then they also would very much want to look at the front and the back and the side. And so the 3D view of it was very important. And so these were sort of the takeaways that we took about, okay, as a P0 going into this, customers at a minimum need to be able to search the way that they're used to searching in person. And they also need to be able to view somewhat of a third 3D rendition of what this is. And we have to make it simple because it's simple for the sellers because they're not going to have 3D renditions of what it is. They only have front and backs. And so how do we sort of, use technology to bridge the gap there?
That's really interesting. So you were going to these shows and doing observational research, basically observing as people were were shopping, and as you mentioned, you had the sellers as well as the buyers, right? So both sides of this being Amazon being a marketplace, that makes sense. So you actually had two audiences that you had to understand their needs, desires, behaviors, and try to create a solution for both. And I'm curious, did you do additional sort of in-depth like interviews or surveys? Was it mostly done through observational or a combination of all of those?
We comboed it with UXR and doing like these in-depth, like, and I'm going to probably not use the right terminology because I'm not somebody who has their like PMP and I went and learned all the specialty terms and names for it. But we did in-depth, like, have the sellers come in and did whiteboarding sessions with them about like, what if we did this? What if we did that? And, had customers come in and try the experience themselves and understand like what, does this make sense? And are you able to get out of this like what you want to get out of this? Are you feeling confident with the shopping experience, which is kind of, that part's kind of a standard like Amazon process when you were building this. So that was pretty much a well-built arm about getting customer feedback about it. But what's hard about getting customer feedback, at least from a stat significant perspective when you're dealing with collectibles, is it's very personal. It's an emotional purchase. So you could still get feedback from like an external customer about the experience and the discovery and, the discovery process and all that. But what you won't be able to land is connecting it to, would they have made the purchase? Because all of that might work, but at the end of the day, you might just not have the selection they're looking for. If they're looking for an 1885 Philadelphia mint penny at graded a 9.5 at PCGS, and that's not in your selection, they might like the experience, but they're still not going to purchase because you don't have it. And so that was something you kind of always had to think about, where it's not always about the revenue or the customer completing the purchase. It was about the feeling and their engagement leading up to that actual point where you're asking them to spend money with you.
That's it. Yeah, that's interesting. Being a collectible, a collector of collectibles myself, not coins. I know what you mean. It's very emotional when you go out there. And I used to do baseball cards, so just a lot of it was like, oh, this feels like a good purchase, right?
Yes.
Even if it's
immeasurable. Yeah.
Was there something that maybe you didn't know that surprised you, kind of an aha moment in this journey of understanding either the sellers or the buyers? Like, wow, we didn't know that before. That is really interesting. Anything that stood out?
There's kind of two things that stand out for me. And one is more like about the way Amazon approached their listings, which again is going to sound like a very simple solution. And the other one is just, I was pleasantly surprised by the individuals in this business. And I don't mean like I went in there thinking like, that they were grumpy or anything. I was very surprised by how much they wanted to embrace this and how supportive. It was probably the most supportive seller base that I had worked with, like having worked with entertainment brands and having worked with like sports collectible brands. They were also very like engaging, but in a different way. They were truly like, it felt like they were fighting for the hobby itself. And they viewed this as sort of this way to just really push forward. And it was such a tight community. And they were so welcoming. To me as kind of an outsider with like this big technical solution. And I got introduced to so many individuals. And they even helped us kind of like tiptoe Amazon's way into other ways of marketing that they wouldn't have done in the past. Like we did the first magazine, like one of the first magazine ads. We did it in a coin magazine and we did like an insert, and Amazon sponsored it. And we worked with a bunch of sellers to put together like a magazine insert. It's just all of these really odd things that you weren't thinking about because I was so like, oh, you launch a business online, this is what you do. And it really helped me understand how does digital and physical, the digital and terrestrial worlds can work together in order to build like an omni-channel type experience. Internal to Amazon, what was very surprising, and this is something I advocated for, was the way that we ingested our data was attribute at a time. And so that's what, based on that, like you would ask a seller, hey, put in a product title. And at the time, what was super hot was keyword stuffing in the title. So you would get buy this 3-year-old's toy for birthday gift, teddy bear, Bluey, blah, 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 blah. And it was like,
right.
5-line title. And what I was learning from the customers, like I was saying before, the way that they search for this stuff was very meticulous. And so I went in with a perspective of, we're not going to ask the sellers to say titles. these have very set attributes, and there's specific ways that these are classified. And it's a very well-documented classification system. And it said, I just want the sellers to give me how they would classify it normally. And then we're going to auto-generate titles for them so that the search experience was extremely clean. And if you were a customer coming in looking for an 1885, you would only get 1885. Because there was no additional keyword stuffing or hidden keywords in there that would then populate a 2020, a 2019 or 2020, a 2012 gold bullion coin to the top, because we wanted to make sure we were focusing the customer on the selection that they wanted. And it was a surprise to me because it seemed like such a simple solve. And every time I give this example to somebody, I'm like, it does seem like it's a very no duh kind of moment of like, why wouldn't you just have, auto-generated titles, because you're gathering all this other metadata. But it wasn't something they had ever thought about before. And in fact, it was a bit of a controversial feature because people were really concerned about what it would do. Like you could potentially, somebody could potentially put something terrible in one of the attributes and, and then you're auto-generating it onto the platform. And it took a lot of internal kind of conversations and politics to be like, hey, how are we going to manage this? But I guess my takeaway from that and kind of advice to the community is, don't overlook the very simple solutions sometimes, because they may seem like, oh, of course we do it that way, or it seems too dumb to think about or too dumb to implement. Sometimes it's the actual right solution. And it actually is, it's our search result, like our conversion off search was one of the highest at the time when the category launched, was because we were able to match customers so well to what they were looking for, because we were so thoughtful about that experience. And so just don't overlook those simple solutions. It can seem really silly at the time, but sometimes it's exactly what the customer is needing and wanting.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, you had a very clear insight about the customers and how they were, the buyers at least, how they were shopping and looking. So you wanted to try to match that, right, by creating this solution that, sometimes the solution doesn't have to be that sophisticated if you understand the problem well. So that's a good. So what happened as a result of this? Are you able to share kind of the results? I didn't have to be financial, but what happened?
So we hit our dates. There was much emotional turmoil, but we hit our dates, and we launched without any Sev 1s or Sev 0s. So everything went off without a hitch. And we actually ended up tying the launch. This is a whole marketing thing. We tied the launch to a exclusive party at the San Francisco Mint. So this is all about like timing of like how that importance of that go-to-market strategy, even from a product management perspective, like that is also really important because you're lighting things up in a very like TikTok manner. And so because we wanted to tie it to this very special party at the San Francisco Mint, we're watching like it go down. They had this auction where they were putting the most rare coin up from this gold coin hoard. And as soon as the gavel hit, we launched the store. And the intent was that that Don Kagan was going to get up and say, now let's go shop Amazon and you can shop the rest of this selection. And so we timed it so that we could do it that way, which I know sounds really like, again, it's like something really silly, but it's actually pretty cool that we were able to time it that way. And we went live on time and we were able to sell, I will say, a very material amount of that collection via Amazon. And we continued to flourish as a business, and it accelerated over time as word got out, and we continued to do kind of like, marketing and other activities, and we continue to build out the feature set and everything. It accelerated substantially. Now, what happened was kind of two things. One, we continued to have to walk that regulatory line because that's what became very obvious, that while this hoard was very important to the collecting business, there was a larger audience for precious metals. And that was probably where we needed to go. And so there was, again, walking that regulatory line. But we also learned a very important lesson that when you have things with an intrinsic value on the platform and one that's very well tracked by, say, a commodities market, you are a magnet for people who like to take advantage of that. And so I got a very quick and fast lesson in fraud and risk, and to some degree money laundering, on how you manage risk and fraud on a platform from a consumer standpoint, and how you have to think about good versus bad actors. And so that's something I've carried forward in my career, because it is still prevalent in the industry. And it's still something that businesses have to think about. And it's just a very different mental track you have to go down because no product manager, no P&L owner wants to think that their customers aren't good. They don't want to think that all the revenue isn't coming from a good place. And so I think my takeaway, and this is kind of the advice I give people today, is I'm like, you kind of have to take a bit of a capitalist approach to it, of like, what are you willing to accept versus what are you wanting to go and be like a white knight for? And we certainly had a very distinct point of view at Amazon about that, which I won't go into detail, but it's definitely an education. I'll tell you that. So
it is interesting. As a product manager, you sort of inherently think your customers are good. And everyone's going to be, and there are some bad actors out there. And if you have a category or a product that attracts those people, which you probably, thinking people are good, you wouldn't even anticipate that until it actually starts happening. That is an interesting mindset. I also love your point about product managers being involved with the launch, the go-to-market strategy. I think that's an underestimated or underutilized part of product management, right? It's really just thinking about how do we go hand in hand with our go-to-market strategy. You're right. It does make sense to do that, especially if you're launching an online product, right? But it's traditionally an offline purchase. So how do you bridge that gap? That's interesting. So I guess in just sort of wrapping up, I always like to ask this question, sort of the hindsight question, right? Which is, what would you do differently? Kind of knowing what you know now, and you could do it again. What would you change or approach it differently?
And it's a good question, because I always look upon this as like, wow, we did a really good job. And I know, again, that's not the right answer. And if this was an interview, I'd be totally failing on this question, because this is one that I like to ask people all the time too. I think we probably should have built it more to support that larger market. Like we were very focused on the collecting industry, and we were kind of swept up in the romance of building, making this digitizing it and bringing in new generations. That we did sort of have to scramble when we realized that most of the sales were headed in a single direction around that monetary instruments. And we didn't particularly have good scalable solutions in place for how do you consume more of that, and how do you consume then like cash currency, like dollars, and instead of just being coins, like how do you consume old stock certificates? How do you consume other ephemera that comes with this space? We just didn't have a good scalable solution. So I probably would, if I had more time, sat down and really built out that like 3 to 5 year horizon of like, this is how this is going to grow and continue to iterate, versus it turning into a really successful category, but not one that we had to immediately sit down and go, now what are we going to do? How are we going to keep the momentum going? And it was sort of like a more of a scramble versus being like an intentional movement. And that's something I carry forward now into my team, where I'm always asking them, like, show me your 3 to 5 year horizons. Like, tell me where this is going. Some features are terminal, and it's just like, you're launching a new payment type, you've launched it. We're done, monitor it, make sure nothing's going wrong. But then there are other things like building a new pricing engine, where you're always going to have to be thinking of the next best thing. And you have to kind of put your mind in that discipline of like, it's not just I've launched the pricing engine, we're done. It's now you have to monitor it and iterate and make it better and improve it. And now new technologies come out and you have to integrate that, and you got to look for, what's working, what's not working. Like, it's always something it's like a plant you have to water. And I think I wasn't thinking of the business that way originally. I was thinking about it as like the payment type, which is like, we've launched it. Great. Now we can go launch the next business.
Got it. It feels to me like a little bit about sort of balancing short-term, long-term, right? You obviously are focused on a short-term objective that 3 months will get this done, but what's your long-term strategy? Of course, if you don't achieve your short-term objective, long-term will never arrive. But so there's a balance between those two. You can't just focus on one versus the other. It's interesting. That to me is a fascinating story, an area that I have no experience with. So to me, I'm already really interested in all the learnings and all the things you did. That's really cool. I want to see if anyone who's listening live has any questions. I know there's a slight delay, so do enter them so we can address them live while we're talking. I will say, though, that if you enter a chat in LinkedIn and we don't get to a live, it will stay there. We can obviously have a conversation offline as well in the chat, like any other LinkedIn post. So it'll be pervasive. I'm looking to see if anyone's actually posting. Sometimes I know in the summer it tends to be quiet too. A lot of people traveling.
I just don't want anyone to come out and ask me like, what's the most valuable coin? I'm just gonna be like, I don't know. Because I didn't learn was like the in-depth like ins and outs of like the values of coins or anything like that. So I was trying to do this as an outsider looking in rather than somebody who themselves was like personally invested in it. And I don't personally collect coins. So
Well, and during the pandemic, collectibles became sort of the rage. And then, like a lot of collectible markets, kind of they go through cycles. I don't know where they are now. Is the business still, as far as you know, is still doing well, or is the
it's sort of, I've heard from time to time from some of the old sellers I used to work with, and it was one of these things where if the management infrastructure is in place, it's going to do well. But Amazon kind of has taken a whole turn with how they looked at their marketplace business, and so it sort of got swallowed up in the broader strategies once I left and some of the other individuals working on it had left, and so now it's sort of, if it's on there, it's very hacky. And the concern around, I'm not saying there's like this huge, I don't want this to be read the wrong way. Like the concern around like authenticity is not there anymore. It's just like, it's sort of back to buyer beware, buyer, buy at your own risk type thing than in the past, where we were sort of curating it a lot more and ensuring that there was this guarantee it was authentic. So it's just a little bit more of a wild, wild west than it has been in the past. And that's okay. Some of these categories, to your point, they come and go, and it big businesses have to look at their P&L and decide what's worth keeping and what's not worth keeping. And we had a path to, everyone's favorite number that starts with the letter B, and it was a very clear one. But if they're not willing to invest, they're not willing to invest. And that's okay. It's not one of the reasons that I left. I left it in a very good state. I left to go pursue other opportunities internally because I had felt it's sort of like this felt like a really like good stopping point for me. And I was able to go on and work on other projects across Twitch and sunsetting my time at Amazon with launching luxury goods with fashion. So I just had other opportunities that I needed to go look at.
Got it.
Yeah.
Really interesting story. I'm so appreciative, Jennifer, of you joining us today. And so I don't see any questions coming in. Again, if you enter them in the chat, we can always get to them later.
Yeah.
We can wrap up the actual interview for today. And hopefully, if you're listening live or listening later, you learn at least one new thing from this conversation. I know I did. Actually, thank you, Jennifer, for sharing your story, sharing your insights, being descriptive. Again, I encourage you to continue the discussion, enter your comments, questions in the chat. And of course, please stay tuned for our next Product Insiders on LinkedIn. We do have another one coming next week. And of course, if you need any help leveraging customer insights to navigate tough product decisions, please message me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to chat. And so until next time, I'm your host, Zach Lyons with Agile Innovation Advisors. So take care, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.